Welcome to the Picture of Success podcast. Here we speak to outstanding mid-career professionals who have made their mark at a young age. Here, you can experience the journey and process they go through to achieve success and adapt learning to achieve your own dreams and purpose. And today in this show, I have Ellisha Othman, the Managing Director of ThriveWell, a social enterprise with a mission to expand trauma-informed community mental health services to individuals, communities, and organizations. Ellisha here is an extraordinary person. Apart from 2 master's degrees, one in the Masters of Commerce from a University of New South Wales and the other Masters in Clinical Psychology, she is also a Eisenhower Fellow. Where in 2020, she's actually one of only 25 women across the world were selected for this program in USA to be building a better world and their society. Now, her diverse experience from being a high-flying corporate professional in to going to ground with the B40 communities has made her a wholesome leader by her own right. And we are very fortunate to have Ellisha in this show. Ellisha, it's great to have you in this show, Ellisha.
Hi, Azir. Yes, thank you so much for the invitation. I feel so humbled to be on the show.
I feel very fortunate to have you in this show, Ellisha. But Ellisha, I believe I've known you for like more than 20 years, right? We actually went to the same university and we even stayed sometime in the same roof in Malaysia Hall, Sydney at one point of time, right? So I kind of like know you a bit, but for the benefit of the audience out there, can you tell the audience more about yourself?
I'm a trained clinical psychologist. Currently, as you've shared in the introduction, the managing director of a social enterprise called ThriveWell. But prior to my career as a clinical psychologist, I was working with UEM for approximately 5 years in corporate finance. And I was also part of the UEM Renong scholarship program. So I guess in terms of that career pathway, I've always had an interest in working with people. Even as a young child, growing up in a household with adults, with my parents, aunts, and helper and different visitors coming in and out of the house. I've always been interested, but I guess I didn't have that, mentor or role model at that time, right, who could direct me to a career in psychology. However, I guess, when you say opportunities come, right, when you're sometimes not looking, my own personal live experience actually triggered it, where when I was studying in Australia, it was before we met at UNSW, it was at University of Sydney. I, was applying for the housing, and
Right.
When you arrive, you apply for the housing, hoping that you get
Right.
a room or a place to stay. And unfortunately, because I arrived a week later, because at that time my father was undergoing cancer treatment, so I had to postpone for a week. The house, all the housing, uni housing was full. So I literally had a public meltdown at the housing office, like just cried and like, oh my God, I'm going to be homeless. Actually, I wasn't. I had friends, but at that point, all these negative thoughts, right? You felt like the weight of the world on my shoulders at that time.
It's very difficult for a young person at that point of time, yeah?
Exactly. And what was striking at that point was that this kind and gentle housing officer, led me to the meeting room, gave me a cup of tea and said, give me tissues, like, it's okay, take your time, just whatever you need. And when I come down, she said, typical Aussie, right? Hey, love, this must be really hard for you. International students usually find it really difficult, adjustment. But we have the services that can help you. And I myself has gone, I have gone to these services. It's basically counseling or, psychotherapy. in our psychology department. Here's the card. If you need me to help you to make an appointment, I can do that for you. But it's really up to you. But I think it will help you. So initially I was like, is this woman thinking I'm crazy or something, So
Asian used to think about that, right? Like,
we
go
come
to psychiatrist,
exactly.
crazy.
Yeah, I come from Malaysia, right? When you say therapy, you're like, okay. But at that point, with your tears, and then you're like, yeah, actually, I think I may need it, right? So I, just build the courage, right, to make the appointment. And, I saw a master student at that time, someone training in the university.
Right.
It wasn't even like a consultant level, it was a master student, very skilled. And I realized, wow, this was what I needed, right? That kind of support. I can't expect of my friends, I can't expect of my family. And obviously that changed my perspective, right, about mental health services. And after that, I was like, oh, maybe this is something I would like, I became interested, but didn't think of it as a career.
Right.
And then later in UNSW, and I joined UNSW, I started joining some of the psychology classes. So even though I was
As an elective, right?
no, not even elective, because it was
You just jumped in.
yeah, those big lecture halls where you just sit in,
Right.
but you realize you're a student or not, right? So and then I'm like, I was really, really intrigued. So, but of course, being the good Asian child, responsible daughter, come home, work, and
Your
do
duties.
exactly, build my skills, right, in corporate finance at that point. It has always been at the back of my mind. So for that, the last 2 years of my time in UEM, I was already planning like, okay, I want to make a career shift. And I spoke to, literally I called up, emailed psychologists working in Malaysia, asking them, and they were very frank. Mental health industry, unless you're in the university or in the private setting, it's not a very sophisticated industry yet. It's very new. Stigma is very high. For lack of a better word, let me quote one of them. You're not going to be rich lah, being in this industry. So this psychologist, gave me all the warning and all that. And I'm like, okay, but let me try. So that's why I enrolled in UKM to do my master, postgraduate diploma.
Masters in.
Because I had to convert, from a non-psychology. So I had to do like a diploma level first and then went into the master's program. And then I realized, wow, I think I found my calling. Yeah. It's just that I have to figure out how to make this work. That's about it, I guess, from my path, my career transition. Yeah.
Right. So if you think about it, right, a lot of people are doing jobs they may not like, right? They may have a calling, right? But you actually decided to take that leap of faith, right? In that sense, to actually let go of this high-paying job, a potential career future that can make you somebody rich and so forth and everything, and you jump into this industry, into this job that is very murky at the start, at that point of time, right? So what actually went through your mind, and how did you overcame that challenge, that stigma, that saying like, I can't do this, what would happen to me, kind of thing, right? What actually went through your mind when you made that change? How did you actually overcome it? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's really a good question, Yazid, because I have to be honest, it was not an easy journey. In fact, I was one more paper to complete my CPA, right?
Right.
A lot of people say, why don't you just complete it? Why don't you just complete it? But at that point, I was like, if I complete this, I will never make the jump. So I had to tell myself, like, I will never make the jump. And if I make this jump and if things don't work out, I can always go back. Yeah. So I see my first career actually is very instrumental to who I am as well.
Right.
The skills that I learned, the network as well that I have is really an important part of who I am now. And I think using that, like that the last 2 years when I was in finance, I think I just go in with kind of a perspective like, look, whatever I do, this is the security. I can always go back to this if I need to, and this skills is transferable in any situation. And true enough, it is what I'm half of my job now is actually managing the organization, right? So whatever the finance management skills that I'm using, which I learned in the first part of my career. But I have to be honest, it's difficult. A lot of naysayers, family especially, because family love you. So obviously they want to protect you. Even until today, I sometimes get questions like, when are you going to get the real job? So, like, yeah, I know my job's not so real right now. Yeah, so it's still, the questions are still coming even till today, right? So I think that's where conviction is very important. I think when I pursued my master's, right, it validated all the things that I thought of. I mean, I knew about some
Right.
of issues, right, in mental health. And the other aspect is that, which I didn't mention earlier on, when I was in Australia as well, I did a lot of volunteering with those associations or clubs, right, and really looked at that issue of inequality in anything like education, health, and all that. So when I went into the master's program, most of my peers were interested in, yes, doing the therapy, intervention, assessment, all the protocols with the clients. I think, particularly being placed. I know we did our placement in public hospitals. What was most striking to me wasn't like the symptoms or the mental illness per se, but the fact that a lot of them don't have access to the treatment, because the treatments are available. I mean, it's the fact that there's protocols, there's psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, but a lot of them have the barrier to access it.
Right. That's a pain point.
Yeah, that's a big pain point to recovery. So, and 80% of the recovery actually happens outside of the hospital. Like,
Right.
they come to us, for example, therapies are average duration is around 45 minutes to an hour, maybe per week. But they have this whole other life in the week, right? That is happening. That the caregivers are, or the family members, or their colleagues, or their neighbors. That's why they're interacting with these people. With the mental practitioners, maybe once a week, once in 2 weeks. So that was what I think, and this comes maybe from my finance background, right? I'm looking at,
Right.
this is such a chronic, I don't know, like
It's an unmet need that's not being addressed by anyone, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It's like there's that underinvestment in the healthcare system, and then there's the needs of the individuals and the family that is not met. So macam like a demand and supply, right? Like the demand and
Right.
supply intersect at all. So now you see there's a huge treatment gap because of all these issues. So it's not just, for me, it wasn't just a mental health issue. And then it became like a social justice issue, because it's issue of access and equity. So, but I felt hopeless at that point. I'm like, okay, never mind. I'm still a junior
Right.
psychologist at that time. Okay, just do my work. Then I joined an NGO, Souls 247, where I was then, I furthered my skill in youth development. So
Right.
working with youth from marginalized background, right? So youth from Sabah, Sarawak, Kelantan, Terengganu, who are, they have zero support from their families. And you can see that although they have the good education given by, the scholarship providers, but a lot of the issues at home are affecting their ability to learn. So again, for me, it's a mental health issue. It's not an education issue, because they are placed in good universities, but again, there's a barrier, right, for them to access the good education due
Right.
to their adversities that they are facing in their life.
Right.
So then,
Right.
yeah, so then I began to see, right, like a lot of those who are affected, there's always a history of not one, I think one adversity or two adversities. Most of them can thrive. Like, for example, if they
Right.
come from a background of poverty, they can still thrive. But if they come from background of poverty, and then maybe there's domestic violence, and then there's access to
Oh, 3 or 4 things.
yeah. So when there's 3 or 4 things, it macam compounds. Yeah. And then at one point, it triggers. And that's when you see them probably in experiencing more of the severe, symptoms, or mental illness later on in life. So it might not happen in high school or in uni, but it may be triggered much later. Yeah. So I guess that's where, yeah, I think that's where I guess I had a slightly different lens when I saw mental health, right? But I felt helpless. What could I do? So I just focus on, okay, let's look at how can we provide as much access as possible. But obviously funding is difficult. And then what I also begin to realize, it's not just the B40. So a lot of these adversities that I see in the B40, when I started seeing, clients from the higher income level, there's
Right.
still incidents of domestic violence among, and it's worse for the T20 or 40 if the experience
Because of
of
the stresses in life and everything.
yes, and reputation. So a person who's like I used to have a client who's a professional, professional experiencing domestic violence at home. She couldn't share with anyone, not even with her own family, because of the shame, right? Like, it's my fault that this is happening. I have no idea. So then then again change my lens. So from just looking at, is it an income issue? It wasn't an income issue. It was really what are the adversities, right, that an individual or family is facing. And some are individual, for example, specific to the family, but some are more collective because they belong to a community. So
Okay, the culture.
culture, and culture can be anything. Culture in terms of ethnicity, culture in a workplace. So if you belong to a company, there is a culture. Then the culture could trigger a particular, like a particular stress level, like burnout in the pandemic. You hear this among the corporate, corporate sector, right? Like every other person's like, oh my gosh, the burnout rate is so high. So I think that led me to look more at the social determinants. So this is what we call social determinants of mental health. Specific underlying risk factors that contribute to mental health issues, challenges, or illnesses, in a particular individual or family. Then it's so much easier to then provide treatment that suits, this particular individual or family or community or organization. Yeah.
Right. So we're going to circle back on the B40 program that you have, but you just touched about something that's very pertinent, right? Mental health issue is not just only B40 because you have stress of money and stress of your environment. It is also pervasive in T20. Somebody, you talk about burnout and everything, right? And you touch on something on shame, on saying, like, the stresses are not being shared. I think it's part of our culture, part of it's taboo in our society, right? Some of my viewers here are young career professionals. Many of them are driven. They want to succeed. They want to just go up in the career ladder. But many are facing burnout and depression, right? So what's your tip actually, right, in achieving career success while in the same time maintaining mental sanity?
Okay, that's a kind of a tough question. I think very tough question, especially when we talk about career. I don't think it's similar for people who are at different stages in life.
Right.
So this is where I like to quote, at least statistics, right? That WHO recently published a mental health report, I think a few weeks back, estimating about 1 in 4 will experience a form of mental health challenges or illness. Right? 1 in 4. So that's
25%.
25%.
What of your workforce?
Yes. And looking at children and adolescents, about half. 1 in 2.
God.
So World Economic Forum, before COVID, this is before COVID, mind you, like in 2019, launched a report, right, on children, youth mental health. So they said that, mental health is the chronic disease of the young. Yeah, mainly.
It's unseen. That's the problem, right?
Exactly. So it is a need. It's because it's also their need. They we can see that environment is changing very rapidly. What the jobs that we know today may or may not be there next year. It could be new jobs or new industries.
Technology could change and everything. Yeah.
Exactly. So the environment is not the cause of mental health, mental illness, clearly, but it is triggering, because then it triggers, more feelings of anxiety, having symptoms of depression, and that's, I think, what I think I want to highlight is that with all these stats, right, we already know that the estimation is there. But what can we do about it? And your question about career pathway, right? It's this is where I think the employers need to play, their responsibility, because they will be hiring the younger workforce, definitely, right? Now particularly, but if they're not addressing the needs of this demographic, then they will also see, have difficulties in terms of productivity or employee engagement, or even high turnover, because that's one of their needs. Their needs is really they need to have that sense of accomplishment, recognition, to be capable. I mean, skilled. I think that's something that all of us, in any stage of life, you need to feel that. But for them, it's not just here, take this work and take this pay, and that's it.
Right.
Or just like suck it up. I mean, I think we graduated in the time of post 97, right? Financial crisis. So we have a different mindset. At least for me, a job is a job, because it's financial, crisis. To have a job is good enough, right? But
especially at these times around, right? Because the economy is not doing too well as well, right?
Exactly. So we are going to see a repeat of that. I mean, economic reports are showing impending global recession, plus the uncertainty and the ever-changing environment. So imagine that we came out of the 97 financial crisis. It was just Asia. The rest of the world was fine. It was Asia. So there were opportunities, right? People who work with MNCs were doing fine. People who were working with certain sectors like oil and gas were doing fine. But it was just affecting certain pockets, like people who were more linked to the financial industry. But now it's across, right? So I think, and this is something that I think a lot of the leadership in companies need to really to accept that it should be part of the employee engagement benefits, and to really understand what's needed of their employees. So I must say, I think it's much tougher for those in the early career stage now. And I'm not sure, maybe Yazid, you can also feedback. I'm sure you're supervising a team, right? So and very easy for us to just be prejudiced and say, okay, these young people are like that. I don't think if we are put in their shoes, I think we would experience this. We would be the same, because it's just such a difficult time in the world right now. Like with so many uncertainties. Yeah.
I guess for the younger generation, right? One of the reasons to choose a right employee or employer, in a sense, is an employer that provides a holistic program, in a sense of career development, the ecosystem support, flexibility in work, and so forth and everything. Because these kind of things are unseen, right? But really, if you provide the right environment, this is where people can thrive and excel, but in the same packet, mental sanity, right? Choose your employers correctly, in that sense, right?
Yes. And I think you highlighted a point. So for especially more of the corporate sector, it's really the personal development is the social determinant of mental health. If the company really looks at the growth and development of the individuals, then most likely the mental health issues would be minimal, in the sense that, everybody goes through stress, but they are able to cope, able to overcome, or resilient enough to be able to overcome. But if this is not provided, if employers just treat, especially the young employees, like workhorse, then unfortunately, this will then trigger. So when you don't do that, then that's where if you don't focus on the social aspect of the development of the individuals, then that's when it triggers the mental health issues and challenges. Yeah. So you highlighted. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, I guess the takeaway here is that more employers need to realize that mental health has impact economically to the company as well, right? You can't just drive people like a workhorse, right? And if you do that, productivity is going to go down, sick leaves are going to go up, absentees are going to go up, and so forth, right? In the sense, right? So we need, yeah.
I think I also would like to highlight, I think, the fact that, when we were studying in Australia, we were, in a social, academically, because we were part of a scholarship program.
Right.
don't realize is, I mean, at that point, of course, we thought, okay, it's just being part of scholarship program, but that, what's the term? The bond, right? That you build.
Commandery or something. Yeah.
Exactly, right? Sorry, I always mispronounce that word for pronouncing for me. That's something that is valuable. I think that a lot of employers forget that, when you join a company, being part of a management training cohort or like a group, right, that you join the same intake or same induction, I think that definitely helps to build the resilience of the employees, because the stress is there. Work will always be stressful. Otherwise,
There's always something to do.
exactly. Otherwise, it will be called play. Like it's work. There's expectations. I mean, KPIs. But when you're able to do it together, you feel that you're not alone in that journey, right? You can bounce ideas. You can, even if you're not in the same department, you can just kind of what we call in psychology like social engagement. When you're in stress, do you notice that you always want to talk to somebody?
Right.
That's a human nature. It's a human nature. So imagine if you don't have that somebody, and you can't
system.
Exactly. And sometimes you can't expect your husband or wife or spouse, to be that entire support, because they may not be in the same work system, right? It's a different culture. So having that peer in that same culture would help you to understand, oh, okay, maybe I'm struggling with my boss, but they might be able to say, hey, why don't you do this or that? So I think this is something we in our program, right, in Thrive Well, we highlight this. Peer support is actually a protective factor for mental health as well. People who are going through the same challenges or same situation in life will be able to, to empower each other, right? Of course, some will say, oh, if they, you sit together and you just vent, is it productive? Yeah, of course, it can be, counterproductive. But I think if you put it if you give it, what do you call it? Like, if it's something where there is a purpose to it, right? I think it can be positive. And this is where the role of mental health experts can come in. We are the experts in mental health. We can come in and facilitate such groups so that it doesn't go to the negative way lah. So we make sure it's that there's a purpose, there's an objective, and it's meant to help the employees. So I think we have to move away from thinking that mental health issues or challenges is the responsibility of one person. So I think
it's a community responsibility.
It's a community, it's a collective responsibility. Just going back to that example, of my example, being, crying and all that, right? And this housing officer is a total stranger to me. But her role, she knows I, work with a lot of young students. The likelihood of them, getting upset over not getting housing is probably quite high. So this is my role, right? Like, let me extend this. I mean, I'm not a psychologist or therapist, but the least I can do is help this, this student get the help that they need. And that's what we need to do more, rather than we give direct advice, very patronizing type of like, you should do this, you should that, but actually listening. I think what we need to do is start to listen and validate the person's feelings and then direct them to the resource, but not forcing. I think that's the way to go, in terms of improving mental health in workplace, schools, and all that. But we need to first learn how to do that. Yeah. So it's not.
I actually love that one point that you said earlier, right? Driving mental health as a community in that sense, right? You're not, I mean, like, if we want to make the world better, you want to make the environment better, you have to approach it on the community, right? And I think among all the segments of society, the most things that are underserved, as you mentioned earlier, is the B40 community. And I believe your work in Thrive Well, you are the managing director in Thrive Well, you actually do a lot of these programs with the B40 community, right?
Yes.
What do you do? Like, what makes you drive to do this, right? And there's not a lot of money to make with this, but you're still doing it. What is that drive? What yeah, in that sense, right?
I think the drive, when we work with the B40 communities, as I mentioned earlier, seeing the, the inequities, right? When I was working in, when I was training in the public hospital, really, I think a lot of them have so much potential. I think it goes back to that. They all have the potential, but because of the um, issue of access, they are limited to the services or resources that can maximize their potential. So and I think this is again maybe going back a bit into my little bit back in time to my high school days. I think what I saw as because I attended a college Yayasan Saat, right, where
Right.
we had
It's a nice college, eh?
uh, yes, definitely, yeah, and good facilities. The teachers were, I would say, real educators. So they really educate rather than teaching a subject, right? They want to get to know you. They want, the teachers were able to identify like the student struggling. It's usually something's going on at home, not necessarily
Right.
like if there's a bullying issue or whatever. I don't know. Like I'm just giving an example, not necessarily that it's happening, but the teacher has the resources because the class size is smaller to be able to identify that, oh, maybe this is something apart from studying. And I think what I learned from my time in KYS, again, giving thanks to Tan Sri Halim Saad, right, for giving the opportunity, is that he created a level playing field for all the students, regardless of your background, right? With good facilities, educators, education, you can maximize your potential. And I saw most of my cohort mates or the
Right.
students there came from not quite humble and underprivileged background, right? And they did so much better than me. I felt like, oh my god, so I'm actually here because of my tuition, because of all these workbooks that I have, like extra classes, piano class, whatever, right? They didn't have all of that, but they were much better than me, academically, and they, so I think having that already that lens, right? So when I worked in mental health, I'm like, if they had the good access, the same kind of treatment, the same kind of services or resources, they probably would have overcome a lot of the
Right.
mental health issues and challenges. But because it was not timely, they didn't get it in a
The right
way,
manner.
right manner, like culture, like language. Sometimes they don't understand. Even speaking Malay pun ada dialect lah apa kan. So all of these things, right? I was like, how do? So I guess that's the challenge. I gave myself a challenge. How do I bring the skills that we're doing in therapy, all this knowledge in the therapy, rather than keep it in the four walls? How can we bring it to the community? We make it easier for them to understand. We make it suitable according to what they need, and not because not everything in that therapy in the room is suitable
Right.
for. So I think that's the equity part lah. Like you take the skills and knowledge that's relevant, then share it, and in an approach that they understand. So like with the B40, we always work with partners. With ThriveWell, we always work, like for example, with Teach for Malaysia, with Women of Whale. We focus on what is their basic needs first. Is it education? Is it income? Is it safety? So if that's been addressed, then we sandwich the mental health in the
Right. Because you can't just say directly mental health, because that is a taboo, right? In a sense.
No. So what we see a common theme in the PPR or B40 communities is family dynamic issues, like could be conflicts, could be misunderstanding, that then can create more problems. Like it creates the problems that we often stereotype, like drug abuse or some of the children, leaving homes and things like that. It's actually a mental health issue. To us, it's not a social problem, but it's a mental health issue. So what we then develop is the keluarga akrab mencapai impian, which we
Right.
call to then cater to the needs of the families in terms of their communication, to empower them to have healthy communication skills. Because if they have healthy communication skills, that's the basic of good mental health, right? Meaning
Precisely.
the child can share with the mom if they're going through something or some issues, or hey, my friend is forcing me to do something I don't want. So that is a very, what we call a protective factor for young adults, especially in the B40 communities. So we adapted it from a program from the US, but we again context adapt it to the language and the approach, and we find that after they complete from the program, they actually come to us to ask about their mental health issues. So they're, hey, okay,
That's good.
yeah, like they're much more open to talk about it. So this is the important part lah. When I say, how do we bring therapy to the community in the way they understand? How to empower the assets. So we see the assets in the PPR community are the mothers. So we have mother support group because they're the ones, if we strengthen the mother's network, the child will get the necessary support. If it's not from their mother, it's from the other mothers that highlighted as well. So we are seeing that other mothers seeing, like, okay, I saw your daughter here, or I saw your son here, and I think in a good way, not in a judging bad way, because previously they did that in a judging way.
Because they don't know better in a sense, right?
Exactly. But now they're using the right language. They show the care, they empathize before, and they don't judge anymore. It's more like, I'm concerned, about, or maybe sharing their own concern about their children with another parent, so that at least they feel I have someone to talk to. Otherwise, it's bottled up, and that's when, all
the problems starts to come out, drug abuse and so forth and everything, right?
Yes. Same for, and I would like to highlight as well, to not discriminate, right? Like, mental health does not discriminate according to income. Actually, everyone, based on the stats, 1 in 4 is literally 1 in 4, not 1 in 4. B40 is 1 in 4, and any one of us are actually susceptible to it. And most of us have experienced it. It's just that it's not, maybe
chronic
not
or not chronic. Yep.
Yeah, not chronic. That we have resources, we can overcome. So I think that's what, like I said, back to that collective responsibility, right? We all experience it. So we should be in this together to help each other out, right? To see how we can support each other. But we need to learn how to support each other. That's also another skill. Yeah.
I like the fact that you are actually your thesis is number one, you want to address the societal problem, go to the root cause, right? And the root cause of the problem is basically, poor mental health knowledge and know-how on to cope on the stresses in life, in that sense, right? So you are actually going to the most underserved, the most difficult to serve community. And if you crack this code, I believe, other segments of society will also benefit in that sense, right? And I believe B40 is not your only clientele, right? Would you want to talk more about Thrive Well services?
Yeah, I think you're right. So we actually at Thrive Well, we have 4 services, what we call care services, right? So we have our clinical mental health services, which is provided at our center in Bandar Utama. So it's mainly the therapy, that we know, like individual, couples, family therapy, career assessments, psychological assessments. So these are mainly for those who are already in the know, already ready to get the services, or referred by another medical or practitioner, or by a educator or teacher. So we provide that to those who are able to afford it. So that's in Bandar Utama. And we also have the employee assistance program, where we then work with employers to provide the mental health services to employees. But we follow a model of, it's always top down and bottom up approach. So we work with the leadership in terms of, advising them on, in terms of their policies, what's helpful, what's not helpful for the staff mental health.
Right.
Even like done, a bit of advisory on, for example, in their strategy, company strategies, right? On how, especially on the people strategies, right? Giving input on that. Whereas the bottom up is really we, create awareness, through talks, through events, before we provide the services, which is in the middle. Yeah, because we notice that if the system is supportive, meaning the leadership, the policies are supportive, and the employees are aware that this is important for them, then the mental health services becomes very useful. Because meaning they know that, this is for me, it's for personal development, and how I can then improve better at the workplace. If it's provided just because, here you go, there's a consultation, usually we find that it's very hard to see a sustained change when the policies don't change, when the awareness of mental health, it's not as well accepted. So it can be seen like a disciplinary, like a penalizing a thing where, okay, managers send their staff because
Right.
so we try to avoid like that kind, yeah. The second service is that we have is advocacy, such as today. So I'm very happy to share in terms of the work that we do. And I think because we focus on social determinants of mental health, we advocate outside mental health. So like public housing conference or child protection conference, things that are not as typical as a clinical mental health, because we need,
But it's linked to mental health.
because that's where when we
The root
when
factor,
the root,
the issue.
yeah, you're right. That's the root, right? So if you focus on that, then our work becomes so much easier. Third one is research. So we do clinical research, particularly on these social determinants of mental health. So we work with organizations such as Wanita Berdaya Selangor, an example to look at postpartum depression, specific topics lah on mental health. And lastly is the community empowerment, which is the B40 lah. Yeah, the one that I mentioned, the KAMI program. So it's 4 key services with the idea that we're able to sustain and provide access to those in need. So for every ringgit that a client comes to the Bandar Utama, right, a portion of it will always be given to those who are in need through the community programs. Yeah.
A true social enterprise.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I love it. That's a fair, right? This is just a typical service in that sense, right? I mean, like you are a psychologist. The typical one, you're a psychologist. I solve the problem, but what you do in corporates, what you do in the society, is that you look at the whole ecosystem, how you can make it sustainable in the sense, right? In the sense, if you do this well enough, you're actually driving yourself out of business.
This is one business where we hope the clients don't stay forever. That's the hardest part about the business model. I don't want my individual therapy clients to stay on forever. That's actually unethical. We want them to be better. We want them to like graduate, right? Meaning terminate effectively, that they can be independent, manage. I mean, again, mental health issues would not, you can't eliminate it, but you can manage it and reduce it to the point that it becomes something that it's just like an eczema, like you manage it, right? Or something like that. So it's something normal. I think for us, we want to normalize it. But and of course, this is also where I know that just having mental health practitioners on our team we may not achieve that. That's why I have engineer, I have an economist, I have social development,
right?
Practitioner on our team as well. So we're also very diverse.
Very diverse.
Jobs, formal training, but all of us are aligned in terms of how do we advocate for a change in the mental health system. Yeah,
I like that, right? Your business is not truly driven by money, but actually a higher purpose. And it does seem that your career, your life journey, the way you see things, it's actually driven by a purpose to make the society better, right? In that sense, right? And I think there's a lot of gold nuggets over here. But I just like to summarize this with one last question based on what you said earlier. Now, if you have a choice of words you want to put on a billboard for the message for the whole world to see, what would that message be?
Building resilience together.
Building resilience together. Short, sweet, and very easy to remember. All right. Thank you very much, Ellisha, for spending time with me, right? And for the audience out there, if they want to find more information about Thrive Well, where do they go to and who do they contact?
Okay, they can go to www.thethrive.center, center, American spelling, thethrive.center. Yeah. And
Thrive.center.
Yeah. And we have our social media, just type Thrive Well. You will see us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. Yes. Yeah. We've been inactive on YouTube. Sorry, we've been busy going out, not busy doing the videos. So we hope to catch up with the videos soon. Yeah.
Will do. Thank you very much, Ellisha, for your time. And it's been amazing and great to be speaking with you. You are a true inspiration. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you like to see more of content like this, do visit us. Do visit my channel here, and there'll be more speakers like this. Again, thank you very much, Ellisha, for joining us. And ladies and gentlemen, please subscribe to my channel for more contents like this. Have a good day ahead, ladies and gentlemen.